Okay, this is a tiny bit intimidating standing up here with the microphone, and I wish I played an instrument. I could entertain y'all a little bit, but I'm happy to be here. And we didn't know if it would just be the two of us or if there would be more. So I'm so glad y'all are here. Thank you. And I really wish that you would speak up if there is some part of the book that you want to draw attention to. I read the book mid-December. I wanted to make sure that I, didn't wait till the last minute. So I read it mid-December, and I really enjoyed it. And so I read it really quickly, and I tend to read late at night. So I read it in December, late at night, and I've been reading up on the book, but I'm probably not going to touch on all the finer points of the book, and I would love it if you all want to bring up any part of the book you especially liked or anything that we could address. So feel free to do that. That will just make this better. How I'm approaching this today is talking about things that interest me. And so I'm very interested in the author. So I researched a little bit about the author, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about her, and then talk a little bit about the book, and then make connections to two other books that I brought, and maybe that would interest you. So I hope that some of what I talk about interests you. I teach freshman composition at UTSA, and if my student turned this into me, it would not be a very good grade, because I did what I tell my students not to do. And what I did is I researched the author and the book, and I cut and pasted, some interesting nuggets of information. Now, I do give credit to my source, which my students don't always do. But no, they do. This is being recorded. My students always do that properly. So what I'm envisioning here is me bringing in some source material that talk about the author and the book and make some connections. But again, it will just be better if you bring up something that interested you with the book. Okay, so first of all, here is an introduction to the book from Joan Frank from the Washington Post. And I think it's a nice way to get this conversation started. She said, Laura Prescott's ambitious debut novel, The Secrets We Kept, arrives with a boatload of preemptive promotional fanfare. What nudges hype aside, as usual, is taste. Are you a fan of noirish narrative, multi-layered, intertwined plots, imagined scenes and conversations mixed with real reportage? Strong, smart women battling tricky cultural, economic, and political mores. And a bonus question, did you enjoy Dr. Zhivago, either the film or the book? If you answered yes to all of the above, you will like Secrets a lot. And so just going back through this quotation, that this noirish narrative was a part of it, multi-layered, intertwined plots, which we'll talk about how it would go sort of chapter by chapter, intertwining some of those stories. Imagined scenes and conversations mixed with real reportage. We'll talk about the research that the author did to really anchor this in historical fact for part of it. Strong, smart women battling tricky cultural, economic, and political mores. Okay, and I have to say, I have not read Dr. Zhivago, and I haven't seen the movie. I had heard about it, I've listened to the music, so probably if I went back or if I read Dr. Zhivago or even watched the movie, that would bring this book even more to life. But I feel like maybe I'm glad I haven't read it yet, because now when I read it, I know so much more about the importance of it and what went into it. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so let me talk about Laura Prescott, and I'm sure y'all noticed her name is spelled L-A-R-A, and we'll get to that in a second. And we know this was her first novel. You could say she was born to write this historical novel. Prescott's mother named her after the doomed heroine from her favorite movie, the 1965 adaptation of Boris Pasternak's epic. So that is why her name is spelled Laura, like the heroine of Dr. Zhivago. Her parents were obsessed with Dr. Zhivago, which wedded a story of doomed love between the doctor and Laura with a political subplot so subversive, no one in Pasternak's homeland was allowed to read it. So Laura Prescott studied political science at American University in Washington, D.C., and international development in Namibia and South Africa. Prior to writing fiction, she worked as a political campaign consultant for candidates including Rahm Emanuel and others. So she had this full career in the political world, which over time she really got tired of. I have a quotation here. She said, "Working in political campaigns inspired my interest in how people use words and attempt to change the hearts and minds of citizens." Wow, how timely is that? The CIA was playing this very long game through soft propaganda, hoping that getting Zhivago into Russian readers' hands and exposing Soviet censorship might spark future dissent. Okay. So in her 30s, after having this career working on campaigns and other parts of political science as a consultant, she applied to graduate school, and her husband encouraged her to pursue writing. She never did because she thought, who can make a living at writing? So she applied to graduate school and was rejected, and she applied again and was accepted into the Michener Center for Writers at UT Austin. And I don't know if you know about that program. I've heard about it over the years, and knowing that she was a part of that, I did a little research. And James Michener, late in his life, ended up in Austin, and I'm not even really sure how. Wikipedia did not cover that, but I think it was through maybe his wife. But he lived in Austin. Up to that point, I don't think he had any connection to UT, but he donated $37 million to UT, making him, of 1992, UT's largest single donor at the time. And I find that so fascinating that that was a connection that came much later in his life, and he was still very loyal to his own colleges and to other things, but UT was the great beneficiary of that money. So they named this writing program after him. It's a 3-year program, and it takes 12 writers each year. And they can be poets, fiction, nonfiction, but 12 writers, and they're paid like $27,000 a year. It's full-time, and they're partnered with mentors. And so, gosh, Laura Prescott really, she got into that program. Yeah.
Despite the fact that she really hadn't written anything?
Yeah.
I don't understand.
I don't either.
Her on the basis.
Right. I guess she had done some maybe political writing, or I don't know. And yeah. And so it's a 3-year program, and it's just this tight-knit community. So that was really, really neat. Okay, so she got in this program. Now, right before she moved, and again, she was in her 30s, So right before she moved to Texas, she got an email that would change everything from a surprising source of inspiration, an article forwarded by her dad. Okay, and right there, that separates Laura from my children, because I send my children all kinds of inspirational and interesting emails that I don't think they ever read, but she read it. And the Washington Post had run a piece linking to declassified documents about the CIA's Zhivago plot. It was at that time that the CIA started releasing the details of what they had done to get that book published. And so it said Prescott dove straight down that rabbit hole to do research on that. And as part of her research, she found and read the autobiography of Olga Iska. Wait, I've been practicing that, and I didn't say that well at that time. But anyway, so she just did all this extensive research. This is historical fiction, and it was really neat for me to read about how deep her research was into these CIA documents and to anything else she could find related to that. So it came at a neat time when she was beginning this 3-year program with this Michener Center, because she started by writing a short story about this. And I guess she read it to someone in one of her first semesters at UT. And the person she read it to, I don't know if it was a professor or whatever, but he said, yeah, no one is interested in Russia, you know. And so she really was wondering, well, do I keep pursuing this or not? Well, she kept pursuing it. And what was neat is in her 3 years in the program, she could explore the story from all different directions. So she would tell it in first person, and then she would write it in third person, and then she would look at it from different characters' point of view. And she just kept working on it. And by the time she was a 3rd year, she showed it to her faculty mentor at the time, who's like, okay, this is fantastic, and this is going to be something. And so she was 36, maybe 35, 36 when all this was happening. So she was shopping this around to different publishing houses. And maybe her agent, someone asked her, well, like, what would you think a satisfying deal would be for this book? And she thought about it, and she thought, I think $100,000 would be good, because then I could really write full-time, and that would be comparable to what she had been getting, maybe a little bit more than through the Michener Center after she graduated. So, because she figured that would give her 3 years to write full-time at the roughly $27,000 a year she'd been getting at Michener. But it was bought at auction in a bidding war by the highly respected Knopf publisher for a reported $2 million. And she evidently turned down a higher offer from a publisher she didn't like as well. So she really, had the upper hand there on who she wanted to publish that. I think the other publisher wanted her to have a 2-book deal, but she didn't want to have that pressure of having that hanging over her head. So, and really, $2 million, I think that sounds fine, especially when you think $100,000 is like a goal, so that is great. Okay, so that's a little bit about her, which I think is real interesting, and we're going to read some more quotations from her in a little bit. But that is, I don't know, in a way it seems like she was destined to write this book, and it was very well received. Won, a long list of awards. I think Reese Witherspoon bought the movie rights, and so we may see it as a movie at some point. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the book itself. And I sometimes look at Goodreads, I don't know if you do, to look at reviews. And here, I thought this was pretty good. This is what how a Goodreads reviewer summarized the book. Okay, this book is all about Dr. Zhivago, the author of it, his lover, how the book was banned, and how America managed to get the book published and into Russia, all based on fact, intermingled with fiction regarding the spies of the 1950s, the typists of the American government who saw all and said nothing, and a forbidden love affair between a typist and a spy. That's a pretty good summary, I think, for a good long book. So, and there's a lot to it. I know not everyone has read the book, so I don't want to, maybe that gives stuff away, but there's a lot to that book. Okay. There are several concurrent stories here, as you who have read the book know, and I wonder if any of you all found that confusing. I did when I was reading. It was like the East and the West, and I would be like, no, who is this? And I know you said you read the book twice, and that really helped.
Well, I haven't read it all the way through, but when I finished it the first time, I went back to the beginning and have read 2 or 3 chapters, and it makes so much more sense now.
Yes, so since you're off the microphone, so someone was saying that after reading the beginning part again, it just makes so much more sense, which I can imagine that would be the case. So I will say I had a little bit of not too much trouble, but like I did have some confusing moments, like, okay, who is this? What's going on? But actually, maybe that's what keeps us interested in that we have to stop and figure things out and really ponder what's going on there. Okay, and the stories are mainly told through the women's perspective, and we're going to talk about that more in a minute. This story happens between 1949 and 1961, so after World War II, right there in the Cold War. And I thought this was interesting. The characters in the East are historical, and we've talked about all the research she did on that. And the major characters in the West are invented. She had read the CIA documents, so they're based on fact, but they were all invented. And East seldom meets West face to face, but the events in each influence the other deeply. And I think that's pretty neat that things going on so far away have such influence on other parts of the world. Okay, so the East part, Russia, focuses on Olga Ivanskaya, who inspired the character of Laura in Dr. Zhivago. Her relationship with Pasternak, her ordeals in the labor camp twice. I mean, the second time I'm like, you've got to be kidding. I mean, that was hard, knowing that. And of course, that's based on Olga's biography, biography. The publication and success of the book, we went through that whole process of watching it written and the challenges and how hard it is to write a book that, he knows is going to bring him a lot of trouble. And the painful consequences for both Olga and Pasternak, not to mention his wife, but especially Olga and Pasternak. Okay, and of course, as side stories, we hear about other writers in Russia and what they faced and the difficulties they endured or weren't able to endure. And then we have the West, which is America, especially D.C. Has anyone here lived in D.C.? I know, Shelley lived in D.C., and Bill, you've lived in D.C. I think D.C. is almost a character in the book. The description of the streets and the weather and the activities and the buildings. I really loved reading about old, D.C. And I don't know, I imagine D.C. has changed a lot over the years, but probably that flavor of D.C. still remains. I don't know if that's true. Okay, so the story of the West, especially D.C., was told through the female typists in the OSS, which is Office of Strategic Services, in the 1950s, and that was the forerunner of the CIA. I had to keep reminding myself what OSS stands for, Office of Strategic Services. And then we have two main voices here. We have Irina and Sally. And Irina, of course, had the Russian, although she kept pointing out, I was born in America, but she of Russian parents, and we later learned what happened to her dad, the cruelty involved with what happened to him, and Sally, who was American-born. Okay, I liked how the book began with the description of the women in the typing service and what they were wearing and how people saw them, but what they knew. That's when I started to get a feel for the title, The Secrets We Kept. They're typing all these things. They're observing what's going on. And, I know there's some men in here, but I think it's fair to say women are very observant. And, I notice things my husband doesn't notice when I'm at parties. I'm like, did you see that? And he was like, no, I didn't see that. But so the women are there quiet, typing in the background, but yet the keeper of secrets and the observers of what's going on. I really enjoyed that beginning of the book, learning about the typists. And the typist backgrounds, the colleges they went to, the education they had, and yet it all boiled down to this was the type of job they could get, all based on how fast they could type.
But they probably wouldn't have even been entertained as an applicant unless they had that college background.
Yeah, that's true.
From one of those Ivy League colleges,
Right. Yeah. But a lot of it came down to their typing test. You know, can you type this many words per minute?
I like how, it's interesting how she called the typist. I mean, that was just a whole, entity in itself.
It was an entity in itself, and I felt this way, and then I read this comment, and I agreed with it, that, like, to me, the women in the typing pool were one entity. So I didn't get a feel, even though their individual names were mentioned, well, so-and-so ordered this, and she sat here, that didn't stay with me. Like, I didn't get a feeling of individual members, and maybe y'all did, but to me, it was one big entity of these women. And yes, they all had their own personality and this and that, but to me, it was more of an entity. Yes.
It would be very helpful to me. I had the privilege of visiting the Soviet Union in 1961, and I also both read the book and saw the movie. But now it's gone some time. It would help me if you could do a timeline of the dates of when Pasternak was actually, having this affair. What was the timeline for that? I mean, I know,
Yeah.
And when the American book came out and the movie. I don't.
Yeah, so I'll look that up because part of it was at the World's Fair when the spies were slipping copies of the Russian book. But before that, it had been published in Italian, and I will look that up. The time frame I have is this book happened between 1949 and 1961. So maybe, and I'll look that up, or if anyone wants to look it up real fast and let us know, but maybe it was, you were in Russia, in the Soviet Union in 61? Yeah.
I got the feeling, I think, didn't it say it was the Brussels World Fair?
Mm-hmm.
58 or 59?
Yeah, so it was,
It was finished by then.
and I do have some information about the year he died, Pasternak died, and so I will get to that. That's great. Okay, so here's a quotation from Christopher Kent. At a time when women were at their most invisible, expected to confine themselves to traditional roles, they made the best spies. It's the female characters who carry this adventure, from the pragmatic, loyal, indestructible Olga to the marvelous typist. With their Virginia Slims and thermoses of turkey noodle soup, they make up a kind of smart, gossipy Greek chorus whose commentary begins and ends the novel. And to me, thinking of them as a Greek chorus sort of underlines how I think of them as this group instead of individuals. Okay, and then I was really interested to find a quotation from Steve Kellman, who's a professor at UTSA, a literature professor, and he wrote this in the Texas Observer. At one point, a character from the typing pool says, quote, Dr. Zhivago is both a war story and a love story, but years later, it was the love story we remembered most. And I think that's true, because even though I haven't read Dr. Zhivago or seen the movie, in my mind, maybe why I never saw the movie is I just thought, well, it's a love story. But this,
How old are you?
I am
65.
50, I was born in 64.
Well, so you weren't very old.
No, I was not very, but yeah, and so my knowledge of Dr. Zhivago is like Julie Christie in a love story.
What I found interesting was the book was, gotten out to most of the world by like 58 or 59 at the World's Fair, and it was made into a movie so quickly.
That is interesting.
Impact.
Yeah, that is interesting. And we need to look up when that movie was made, because that would give us the timeline. So he said, the same could be said about The Secrets We Kept, which depicts cultural warfare between two nuclear superpowers while also focusing most vividly on two sets of lovers, Pasternak and Ivanskaya, and Drozdova and Forrester. Drozdova, born in America to an emigre mother after her father vanished into prison, applies for a typist position at the CIA and ends up as a clandestine courier. One of her assignments is to disguise herself as a nun and hand out copies of Dr. Zhivago at the 1958 Brussels World Fair, sowing seeds of dissent planted within a smuggled book. Irina is trained in her task by Forrester, a beautiful, flamboyant, and unpredictable veteran spy. The love that develops between them is as taboo as the repressive, homophobic America of the 1950s, as writing a novel with a jaundiced view of the revolution is in Russia. I thought that was a nice little observation there. Okay, let's see. One criticism was that that I read was that you didn't really get a feel for the other spying that was going on. And we did get, I was nervous reading it. That's always my test. Like, is it realistic? Did it make me nervous? It made me nervous. But someone said, like, the action did not really focus on the spy narrative. And so I brought a book in. It's funny how things fit together in life. That, like 2 months ago, my husband read this book, A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of the American Spy Who Helped Win World War II. And like, as he was reading it, he was like, oh yeah, you should not read this, because he was like, it's so brutal, and it's a real life story about an American spy, a woman, through World War II. But what is interesting to me, and let me find my Kindle, is the woman that this is writing about. Virginia Hall, a Baltimore socialite who talked her way into special operations, the spy organization dubbed Winston Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. She became the first Allied woman deployed behind enemy lines, and despite her prosthetic leg, helped to light the flame of the French resistance, revolutionizing secret warfare as we know it. Does that sound familiar to any of you? When this was first, let's see, here we go. I did highlight this. Early in the prologue of the book, The Secrets We Kept, when it's talking about the typing pool, it says, we think of Virginia sitting at a similar desk, her thick yellow cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, no matter the season, a pencil stuck in her bun atop her head. We think of her one fuzzy blue slipper underneath her desk, no need for the other, her left leg amputated after a childhood hunting accident. She'd named her prosthetic leg Cuthbert, and if she had too many drinks, she'd take it off and hand it to you. Virginia rarely spoke of her time in the OSS, and if you hadn't heard the secondhand stories about her spy days, you'd think she was just another aging government gal. And so as I read that, I was like, okay, I think that's who this book was written about, and it was. So even though the East part was more based on historical fact, this, she obviously had done her research. So I'm saying, if you want more of a spy thriller, a real-life spy thriller about World War II, you might be interested in A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of the American Spy Who Helped Win World War II. And it's interesting because, again, I have not read this book, but as my husband read it, he was like, oh my gosh, it was exciting, it was scary, she was brave, it was like there was torture and everything. And then you get to this book and you see, well, after all of this excitement, she was a member of the typing pool, and you would never know what she had gone through in her past life, just 10 years earlier, if that. So I thought that was an interesting connection. And, okay, another thing I really liked about the book, I liked a lot about it, but I kept thinking of the secrets we kept. So every time I would think of the spies, that's a secret. The love affair, that's a secret. All of these. But I thought it was really nice. The last secret, one of the last secrets that I read about was about the mother. And I'm going to read that. So this was near the end of the book. We unveil ourselves in the pieces we want others to know, even those closest to us. We all have our secrets. Mama's was that she'd been generous to a fault. I discovered she clothed nearly our entire neighborhood for free. She'd tailor a secondhand suit for an out-of-work veteran with an interview to be a cashier at People's Drug, repaired the bridal gown of a woman who could only afford to buy one with the broken strap and a wine stain on the bodice from the Salvation Army, patched the coveralls of a bottling plant worker, and mended many socks for an elderly widower who just wanted some company. And I just thought that was a really touching, poignant secret. That was the mother of Irina. And, you know, here they lived together. I know. They lived together, spent all this time together. She saw her mother sewing. Her mother presented a story of what she was doing and who she was doing it for. And it wasn't until the mother died that she learned all these secrets her mother had.
I felt like the whole book was nothing but secrets.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a hard time figuring out. They didn't know much about each other.
I agree. Even though they lived together in a small apartment, that after her mother's death, she learned of her mother's secrets. I thought that was really, and you know, as you said, it's all secrets, but it was neat in this book that's about spying and relationships that another secret unfolded with the mother's sort of secret generosity that the daughter never knew about. And yeah, I don't know. And a shame, it's a sort of a shame that we learn things too late, isn't it? But
It characterized the mother differently than
it does.
she didn't ever see her as that necessarily.
Exactly. So I liked that. Okay, and then I want to do two more things. I found this article written by Laura Prescott. I won't read all of it, but I want to read parts of it, and it talks about Pasternak's death, and I think it has the year. And she wrote this for the National Post in Canada right before her book was published. And so I'm going to read some of it. In 1956, the most famous living Soviet writer completed his masterpiece. The author was Boris Pasternak and the work Dr. Zhivago. It was censored and censured in the USSR and celebrated in the rest of the world. But while most eyes looked toward the famous man who wrote it, I was more interested in the two women behind him, both of whom suffered greatly and have largely been lost to history. They form the backbone of my new novel, The Secrets We Kept. And I like this because it talks about his wife, because I was really curious about her. As Pasternak worked on Zhivago, his wife, Zinaida, cooked for him, cleaned for him, cared for their children. She was a strong Russian woman who was practical and, according to Boris's great niece, Anna Pasternak, rigorous to the point of military standards in her domesticity. She nurtured him back to health after several illnesses and made their home a peaceful one. In fact, she created the perfect conditions for her husband to write, but that wasn't enough for Boris. He was a poet, a romantic, in constant need of intellectual stimulation. So when in 1946 he met Olga, a single mother, 20 years his junior, who was also a writer, he fell in love. And so when the Soviet censors heard word of what Pasternak was working on, they began to pressure him into abandoning the project, one of their first orders of business arresting his mistress. And so she was taken to the prison where she was interrogated about his work. She refused to give information, so she was sentenced to the Gulag. She spent 3 bone-crushing years in work camp, enduring unthinkable cruelty, which we read about. When Stalin died in 1953, she was eventually released, along with thousands of other political prisoners. Then after that, she fell right back into Pasternak's arms, even moving from Moscow to a country home, just a short walk from the country Dhaka where he lived with his wife. Okay. By this point, Pasternak was nearing the end of Zhivago. He would sit at home and write at a furious pace, with Zinaida keeping his household running and Olga becoming his sounding board and unofficial spokesman. Their work was not to be rewarded as predicted. Zhivago was deemed unfit to be published in the USSR, which according to Soviet law also precluded publication elsewhere. Despite the global ban, he gave his manuscript to an Italian publisher, bringing great danger to himself and his loved ones. You are hereby invited to my execution, he said as he handed over the brown paper package. That made me nervous reading that part too. And it wasn't until Olga was like, do you know what you've just done? You know, and I think he knew, but it affected more than just him.
Well, it affected his mistress and his wife greatly.
Yeah.
They were the ones
Who paid, yeah,
physically.
exactly. And then, okay, and so then it says, Pasternak died in 1960, so right before you got there. And Zenaida was at his bedside, and Olga was barred from entering their home. Only after Pasternak had passed on was she allowed to see him. Afterwards, she was sent back to the Gulag. Charged with having accepted foreign royalties from his publication, she served 4 years of an 8-year sentence. Eventually, in the 80s, she was rehabilitated under Gorbachev. She died in 1995 at 83. I mean, I was like, don't send her back, you know, and she and her kids, and she knew she was going. Oh my gosh, that was hard. And it was told from a woman's perspective, all these different stories, and it made me more critical of Boris because I'm like, look what he's doing to everyone. Although, you know, his art remains, and eventually the stories were told.
Well, you know, that what I thought of is that they willingly all, maybe not the wife, so, but they were all, mistress was involved willingly.
Yeah, that
This was her passion.
it was. Oh my goodness, it was. Okay, and one other connection I want to make is I started reading this book, and it's slow going. It's really good, but I have to read it like 3 times per chapter. And it was written by Robert Gates, and it's The Exercise of Power, American Failures, Successes, and a New Path Forward in the Post-Cold World War. As we all know, probably, Robert Gates was former Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush and Barack Obama, a member of the National Security Council staff in 4 administrations. He's served 8 presidents. And what I like about this book is the concept of this book is he's describing a symphony of power that the United States can use and has used since becoming a world power. And these are the types of power he writes about. There's military power, which seems to be the one we all think of first. Many of us think of first. There's diplomacy. There's economic leverage. There's cyber capabilities, development assistance, communications, intelligence, alliances, science and technology, the private sector, religion, nationalism, wise and courageous leadership. And then he talks about 2 types that I saw appear in this book, culture and ideology. And he says, in 1945, Americans tired of war had no interest in a conflict with the Soviet Union to prevent its takeover of Eastern Europe. And beginning in 1946, a Democratic president, Truman, and a Republican Congress together dramatically cut the size of the U.S. military. And Truman turned to non-military forms of power to thwart further communist expansion. And I think that really goes hand in hand with what we're reading about here. And with how it goes on with ideology, Gates describes the conflict between Soviet communism and Western democracy as, quote, a conflict between 2 fundamentally different approaches to social organization, one based on protection of the rights of the individual and the other on subordination of the individual to the interest of the masses, manifested in the state. Since our earliest days, the United States has been a beacon to oppress peoples everywhere, not necessarily for our political system, but because we have been the most steadfast example and proponent of human rights and individual liberty and defender of the repressed everywhere. Although we have fallen short of the ideals, we never have abandoned our aspirations. I love reading that and being reminded of that. And so Gates is talking about there are so many ways that we can have power, and it's not just always military or even diplomacy, it can be through culture, and that's what we see here. So back to Steve Kellman, the UTSA professor, he said, from 1950 to 1991, the CIA clandestinely dispersed as many as 10 million books, literary time bombs throughout the Soviet bloc, getting that word out there. And then The Guardian, an article in The Guardian said this, at the height of the Cold War, the CIA ran an initiative known as cultural diplomacy, again, tying into what Robert Gates was talking about. Following the premise that great art comes from true freedom, the agency seized on painting, music, and literature as effective tools for promoting the Western world's values and funded abstract expressionism exhibitions and jazz tours. But when it came to the country that produced Tolstoy, Pushkin, and Gogol, a nation that, quote, values literature like the Americans value freedom, the focus was always going to be on the written word. The part the CIA played in bringing Boris Pasternak's masterpiece, Dr. Zhivago, to worldwide recognition was the jewel in cultural diplomacy's crown. The secrets we kept was centered on the belief that a piece of art can change the world. Using books as political weapons might seem out of touch today, but Ms. Prescott sees a connection to the present. Words are so powerful, even if it's not books. Tweets and social media are now the tools of propaganda throughout the world, she says. The delivery might have changed, but it's the same attempt to change people's minds. And how interesting is that, that it's really so true today. Okay, and then I want to end this discussion with Laura Prescott, what she said. When asked what she's proudest of in her book, she says, I wrote a book that I would love to read, and that my sister and my mom would want to read. What more can you do? Isn't that great? Okay, so did anything else strike you about the book that you want to bring up? Yes.
Well, I was very impressed with how the Russians love poetry. I didn't realize that. And so, and that's what Boris Pasternak was.
Yes.
And that was a new thing to me, that was really what he was famous for.
And Stalin loved his poetry.
Yeah.
And he didn't know what to feel about that. Like,
Being disloyal to his day.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Well, and that just shows you can't squash or push the human spirit and how we respond to works of art.
That's right.
And it mentioned it's often on during the book that the United States was following this theory of soft propaganda.
Right.
Yeah, they call it soft power.
And, using a Russian's book published in Russian, it's not like we manufactured the art or, it was bringing life to a Russian artist's words and ideas that were deemed too dangerous. And, Irina, I guess when she dressed as a nun, she just felt it was like just so easy for her to hide and to be the spy. And the picture of her handing out books at the World's Fair.
I thought that almost sounded too good to be true. The way,
Yeah.
she described it and the way it just came off so smoothly.
Me too. I was expecting something big and bad to happen.
Or I was like expecting people not to take the book back.
Right.
Or to,
And early in the book, do you remember how the women would tear the insides out of books and put the covers on other books to distribute, to sort of hide them that way?
The other thing that I guess I like to like the people I'm reading about.
Yes,
And I had some trouble with Boris Pasternak.
yes, I did too.
Especially the way he pursued Olga, and he didn't want to divorce his wife. I read some other books
Mm-hmm.
because he had been divorced once and that was enough.
Right,
Although what he was doing was so dishonest.
right. And then you read this passage about how his wife was just this super, housekeeper and kept things in order and provided him with the perfect environment to write in and raise the kids. Yeah,
It's just like that old thing that behind every man, a big man is a big woman.
yeah. And he sort of had two, I guess, because one kept the house going, and one he could talk about his lofty ideas and had, knowledge. And yes, I agree with you, and I like the way you put that you like to read about characters you like, and you had a little trouble liking Boris.
Trouble with her in her dealing with her children.
I did too. I did too.
I felt like by the time, like her son was a young adult, and probably her daughter too, didn't go into as much detail about her, but they paid so much for the way she lived her life.
They did.
He was traumatized
Yeah,
by the time he was in his early 20s.
yeah,
He was lost.
yes. I agree totally that I had trouble with that. And knowing, she knew what was going to happen to her kids.
Yeah,
And she just didn't know when that knock was going to come at the door.
right. But then it was interesting, she wrote that book. She wanted her side.
Yes, yes, exactly. It was interesting that this was told through the women's point of view, both East and West.
Yeah, it probably would have been so different.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he refused to go to Germany when he could have, because he couldn't give up Russia.
Yeah.
That strong hold
Mm-hmm.
was really interesting on him, because could have written in Germany.
Right.
His
You think of
family
the Russian authors who've come to America to write.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was, from the very beginning, I was sucked into it. And my husband and I share a Kindle. And so he started reading it even a day before I did. And he was like, this is really good. So I thought, okay, yes.
Well, forgive me, I haven't read the book, only have read Dr. Zhivago, saw the movie, but in reading the book and seeing the movie, you never got the idea that Dr. Zhivago was in any way autobiographical of Boris Pasternak.
Really.
And the character of Dr. Zhivago is extremely likable. It's and the book itself, it's baffling in a way to understand just how bizarre the mind of the central planning people operated to want to ban it, because it seems, as far as military secrets, very, very harmless.
Right.
It depicted a zealous Communist Party member, bulldozing around the country. He had his own private train with red banners all over it, and he would come charging into town on his private train, exhibiting power and calling people out. And I depicted it
Mm-hmm.
a bully and an objectionable, unlikable person, So, but the truth that couldn't be concealed really is that the whole thing that lasted 70 years from the revolution to 89 or whatever, 90, was a flop. Life was dismal.
Right.
I mean, the Russian people were never happy, and it just kept going on and on. Well, when are we gonna, they could brag about a few things. They got ahead of us in space.
Right.
But thinking that had happened just, in the 50s.
And this book addressed that.
And so they were very proud of that.
Yeah.
And, but when I was there talking to the people, of course, they want to get into arguments about it, and I would say, well, everything is really so much better at home, and they'd say, yes, but, and this is very significant, especially today, said, but you have a terrible problem with racism and
Mm-hmm.
You know, they had done a lot of research on that, and they could point to token black people. They had very few black people, but they did bring in blacks and give them scholarship at the University of Moscow. And I just one quick
Yeah.
story. There was a president of Ghana named Nkrumah back in the 60s. You may remember the name Kwame Nkrumah. Well, so when we landed, we entered from India. We were on a round-the-world trip, my college friend and we flew from Delhi to Tashkent, which is in Samarkand in Central Asia. And as we were riding in the car in from the airport, there were these big banners in English over the road saying, "Welcome Nkrumah, friendly president of Ghana." And of course, in English.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I looked at the guide and I said, "What? You know, what is this?" And he said, "Well, you see, he can't read Russian, but he does know English, you know." But so there's the irony of
Yes.
the power of the English and the power of the currency of the country. When it came time to leave the Soviet Union, we were going on a Soviet flight from Moscow to Cairo, and all the other passengers were Russian. And so when they exchanged their rubles to leave on the trip, they all had dollars.
Yeah.
They didn't leave the country with
Right.
rubles. They all, and everybody got dollars, you know.
Yeah.
And, you know, so there was, and then if you went into the countryside, everything was real poor. It was like documentaries. You see how the rural America was
Mm-hmm.
50, 60, well, 100 years ago now, you know. Open sewers, just really, you know,
Right.
just nothing, you know, it just, everything was extremely backward, you know.
Right.
So the fabric of the country was just very poor.
Yeah.
And they never could get a handle on that.
Well, it was just so dismal. I mean, every picture you've ever seen of not just Russia, but any of those European
Mm-hmm.
countries, I mean, everything was gray.
Right.
Just the buildings they lived in,
Mm-hmm.
the buildings they worked in,
But yet these artists were given, they had their little community, and his house sounded, you know, cozy.
And to be watched over.
Well, yes. Yeah.
they put them in
The
those
other,
communities. So
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting too, how she wrote about the relationship between Dolly and how they ended up.
Mm-hmm.
That Irina
Irina, yeah.
didn't want that, I mean, she had that wonderful man that
Yes.
was so good to her,
Yes.
gave that up,
Yes.
and Dolly was a unique character.
Mm-hmm.
What do
Yeah.
you think about her? How did she develop her? Was she somebody that, you know,
I didn't read about how she developed that character. Other than that, it was fiction, you know, that she just created that story.
which one are you talking about?
Sally?
Sally. Oh,
Yeah.
Dolly.
Yeah.
No wonder I was confused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if she was,
Based on,
Spy that-
yeah,
you know,
right.
was in World War II and,
Yeah, I didn't read anything about that,
yeah.
other than it was, you know, fiction.
Right.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, based on, yeah, like others. Yeah, I didn't read, you know, in my extensive research on this, I didn't ever read anything about Sally and how she was developed.
Yeah, and so I wondered why,
Yeah,
you know, she,
I think it adds to one more secret,
Right.
you know.
I was
Yeah.
thinking about that. That's kind of probably the big secret.
Yeah, yeah,
It seems like they developed her kind of as a Quincy, what I hate to say, Quincy Decimal's spy woman.
yes, yes.
All these,
And beautiful clothes and, yeah,
dashing,
mm-hmm, yeah,
and such a presence and a,
I don't know. Thank you so much. Well, I appreciate y'all. You know, I never exactly know what to talk about, so I decided just to talk about things that interest me and hope that they interest you too. And
The style of clothing and the fact that she had, I think it was this book, she had one dress.
y-
I mean, I think about our closets.
yes,
now.
yes,
God,
Well, I guess they would take their money and invest it in one really nice thing.
right.
Instead of the way we do it now.
what a difference.
Although I'm going to be back in May, and I was thinking, note to self, do not wear this blouse in May, since I'm being recorded. Exactly. Well, thank you all for coming out. It's so much nicer talking to people. Thank you so much.